Hello, welcome back to my channel. It's that time of the month again where I do my monthly wrap up. Now, I have read a total of 11 books this month in November, so I'm splitting this video up into two parts because no one wants to hear me talk for that long. So I'm going to be reviewing the first 6 books I read in the month of November, and as the title suggests, I read about books that deal with directly topics or themes of AI, art school, and matchmakers. So if any of those sound interesting to you, please stick around and we will get started. The first book I finished, which I read partially over Halloween, was Knock Knock Open Wide by Neil Sharpson. Have you ever read a book, finished it, and when you're done, close the book and wonder, what the hell did I just read? Because that's what I thought when I finished reading this book. I finished this a little less than a month ago, and I am still actually having trouble piecing together what actually happened in the ending. I don't honestly remember it that well, and I think it's because I did not really understand it. Now, I still enjoyed the book overall, but there's a lot that went over my head, so this is a summary. The book starts on Halloween, 1979, somewhere in Ireland, and we're following this Irish woman named Itan. I looked up, there's different pronunciations of how to say her name, so I'm sorry. And this young woman is driving back from a Halloween party at her sister's, and she's newly engaged. And as she's driving along this desolate country road, her engagement ring, which her fiance gave her, which is a silver heirloom ring, is starting to feel weirdly tight, and the radio starts to play static, and she starts to feel very tired and almost hypnotized, and she comes across this corpse that's just lying in the road, and he's being eaten by a dog. So she decides to pick the corpse up and drive him to get help, and when she does that, she's attacked by this wild pack of dogs that seemingly come out of nowhere. And so she drives to this old farmhouse where, unbeknownst to her, the farmer and his wife, this older couple, are engaged in this weird sacrifice in order to get land where that involves silver rings and a child's TV show. And so the next morning, when Itan wakes up, she wakes up in a ditch, and the farmhouse is burnt to the ground, and she has absolutely no memory of what happened, only that something very traumatic happened to her. So the next timeline in the story, we sort of switch back and forth between the 70s, 80s, and the early 2000s, is Itan's daughter, Aisling. And we follow Aisling at this college, and she gets involved with this other young woman named Betty. But Aisling is sort of romantically and emotionally elusive. She's not quite sure of what she wants, and she feels that she has all of this unresolved trauma in her family from her mother, who doesn't really talk about what happened that night and is now just a recluse, and I think becomes an alcoholic, to we learn more stuff that happened in this family, where Aisling had a sister who went missing, and her father also died under mysterious circumstances. And so Aisling, while she has feelings for Betty, she is more interested in solving what specifically happened to her sister. And all she knows is that it is connected to this childhood TV show. The same TV show that the farmer was playing that night stuff went down. This is a gripping story. I will give it that. It did genuinely spook me in the beginning. The scene where Itan is driving along and comes across this corpse in the road, it did genuinely make me feel like my hair was, the hairs on my arms were rising. But I felt like there were sort of issues for me with pacing. The part in college with Betty and Aisling's relationship did start to get a little too drawn out. And then, the last quarter of the book, I honestly did not understand what was happening. I think it's because it borrows from so many different Irish folklore, and I don't have a background in that. I don't honestly know any Irish folklore, and so that I just was completely lost. And there was a lot of stuff that was happening very quickly, right? I think what was well done, besides the creepiness in the beginning, was this weird childhood TV show and the juxtaposition of childhood innocence that is associated with the childhood TV show, but also this creepiness. And the only way I can think of, the only other person I think who's been able to convey that, but in film, is, you guessed it, David Lynch. This, besides borrowing from Celtic folklore, I really do think that this novel also borrows from Mulholland Drive. I am completely convinced of these two lesbian women, Betty and Aisling, or I should say in this lesbian relationship, and Aisling is bisexual and sort of really confused and has this mysterious past that she can't quite remember, but she knows something traumatic happened to her. I mean, come on, this is literally like the plot of Mulholland Drive. So, like I said, I just wish I understood the mythology more, the backstory, because I just don't really understand what happened, and I don't know if it's just me being dense and not getting it, or if it's like an issue on the author's part. So overall, I just feel like there were some loose ends that needed to be tied up that just had I had questions over. I still rated it 4 stars. I still think it was mostly compelling. It's definitely unique, even if I did have an issue with some of the pacing. The next book I read in November was Endling by Reva. Now, this was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and is set on the eve of the Russian invasion of February 2022. So we have several different people that sort of make up the plot of this novel. We have Reva, who is this snail biologist who funds her research by moonlighting at a matchmaking agency called Romeo Meets Yulia. I love that name. We have 2 sisters, Nastasia and Solomia, who also work for the same agency, but they are searching for their feminist mother, who mysteriously was kidnapped for her activism, they believe. And the sister's mother, she was an activist that is part of a group in this book that is very clearly based on the actual Ukrainian feminist group Femin. It's quite obvious. And then the sort of third, fourth character we follow is this young Ukrainian-Canadian man named Pasha. And he was born in Ukraine, but he grew up in Canada, and he's returned to his birthplace to find a wife and start over fresh in, I guess, Ukraine, because he's a loser in Canada. This was the only thing where I felt that this was the only character I felt like his motivations were not really clear to me, and I don't know if the author provided enough psychological insight as to why men are motivated to go bride shopping. And I think I know why, because I think if she did explore it enough, he wouldn't come across as a sympathetic character. But yeah, whatever. So this is a work of metafiction, because the last character that is interwoven into this story is the author. And when I was reading this, it did kind of take me out of it, because it immediately becomes, I don't really know at what page, maybe 70 pages or so in, it becomes meta. And I think this is sort of why a lot of people I saw online were divided about this novel, because I don't think that even when you're reading the plot of this, you don't get the sense that this is going to be metafiction. So in this, we get the author's process of writing this novel, how her editor told her she just had a series of instances strewn together, just these literary yurts, and how they did not make a novel. And then there's sort of this diversion of her talking to a yurt maker, which I think is just imagined. But I do think actually that the meta aspect, she is able to interweave it back into the story. And I do actually think that the meta version was this is where most of the novel's heart is, I think, because you have the author discussing her family, specifically her grandfather, who still lives in Ukraine, and he's there during the war, and he refuses to leave. And so you have more of the sense of urgency, and I think it gets into aspects of as writers and the world that you create, you sometimes almost want to write your own reality. And so some of this becomes wish fulfillment about how she wishes that the characters in her novel could go and save her grandfather. This actually did remind me of Kaveh Akbar's Martyr in different ways. I I mean, they're both good. I think I liked this a little more, though, because Kaveh Akbar's was almost, was a little too lit bro-y for me at times. But both novels deal with, like, questions of identity, like having the hyphenated identity. Like, you are of this background, you were born in this country, but you spent most of your life living in the global north, whether it is America or Canada, and then you're watching this tragedy unfold in your birthplace. And what does that feel like? Like, you are not there. You are physically not there. So you're not like a firsthand witness to it, but your heart is there and it still feels traumatic to you, even though you still have all of the basic necessities and the comfort of the first world. And I do think that this novel also really illuminates the human cost of war and gives voice to, like, the real people behind just the cold statistics of it, right? I mean, one of the best lines is, why must a country be bombed before we care about it? So overall, I thought this was pretty well done. It was very memorable. I think was unique. Again, I do feel like metafiction is really popular right now. I've read so many books that are metafiction. I feel like I should just create a video about metafiction. But yeah, I definitely recommend this. I could see why it was shortlisted for the Booker, but I would definitely recommend it if you want to read about Ukraine. And I would rate it 4.25 stars. The next book I read was Codependent, Living in the Shadow of AI by Madhumita Murgia. Hope I'm saying that right. This is an investigative journalism book about the current state of AI and the human side, the human cost of AI, what goes into making AI, who are the humans behind that. And generally, they are people from usually marginalized backgrounds. So in each chapter, we follow one or two people who sort of become a stand-in for the specific region or a group of people that the author is focusing on. And I will say that the first chapter, which is definitely one of the most interesting, follows gig workers that go into labeling images for AI. So whether it is images for maps or images for, say, like human anatomy, for doctors, stuff that assists doctors. We follow gig workers who do this in Kenya, as well as refugees in southeastern Europe who are, like I said, these gig workers, and the shitty hours that they have to do, although most of the people she interviewed seemed to like this aspect of the work because they were able to work from home, but also goes into content moderation and some of the people who have been negatively impacted by seeing some of the most awful images, because content moderation is, yes, there's a human side to this. Humans are the ones that have to code machines to be able to identify harmful images. One of the most terrifying aspects of this chapter was the chapter on pornographic deepfakes. And so she follows a couple different women who have been impacted by this. These were just regular women who honestly just had like Instagram, Facebook, and they found that their face had been deepfaked into pornographic materials that were circulated online. It was quite terrifying, to be honest. There's another chapter that goes about gig workers, specifically Uber drivers and the algorithm, and how Uber drivers and riders are matched. And there's one section about how this group of Uber drivers felt that they were being cheated out of their proper compensation, and so they came up with like a certain code to calculate how much that they actually were owed from the company. So yeah, I think this book was really eye-opening because it did make me realize the human impact that goes into creating AI, as well as the broad umbrella that AI encompasses. I don't know why, but I never really thought of algorithms as being AI, but they absolutely are. I think when a lot of us now, when we're talking about AI, we are talking about generative AI, we are talking about ChatGPT and stuff like that. And she does go into that a little bit. But this, because technology is so fast moving, I think this book was published in 2023. There are times where it feels a little bit outdated. And there were certain chapters that did start to feel repetitive. There's a chapter where she focuses on poor indigenous women in Argentina, and they were part of this sort of trial where the government collected information to find out which women would be at risk for teenage pregnancy. But then the government never did anything with this information. They never consolidated it into an app. And so the government just has this information. And yes, it was scary, and it was a part, like, it's all, you know, connected to surveillance capitalism, surveillance technology, but like nothing really happens. And so she already covers a lot on surveillance technology with China, as well as in the UK with policing. So I just felt like this chapter I don't think was really necessary, and there was other aspects that she could have gone into. I was very much surprised that she did not talk about AI's impact on education or AI's impact on the environment. Specifically, she uses a term. She did not come up with this phrase, but it's called data colonialism. And it is about how AI, the profiteering of the data of marginalized and vulnerable people to build AI systems. And I feel like if you're going to talk about colonialism in any aspect, you need to absolutely talk about the environmental aspect. So those are big chunks of the book I felt that should have been dealt with. I had a couple issues with this book besides those. My issue was that this author, I think, tries to come across as very progressive and forward-thinking, right? But I don't know why. There are parts that rub me the wrong way. She seems to naively believe in, like, the goodness of big tech CEOs and big tech companies, and it just didn't sit right with me. There's one sentence, I actually wrote this down, where she says, she's talking about OpenAI, and she says, it had been set up by radical tech entrepreneurs, including Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, I don't know how I say that demon's name, out of a concern that AI would end up destroying the human race. The solution? To fund the creation of a benevolent AI system that they could control to do good, not evil. I mean, really? Like, do you really think that these men had altruistic visions initially? And then the last chapter, which unfortunately left a bad taste in my mouth, was, I don't think she really knew how to end it. And so she sort of writes about this incident that I don't know if it happened in 2022 or 2023, where these religious leaders met in Rome along with some of these big tech CEOs like Microsoft, and they signed this document that was supposed to be about AI and human rights and upholding human rights in the face of AI. And it just really rubbed me the wrong way, because I'm like, really? You're going to put your faith in religious leaders and big tech companies? Particularly because, like, some of those religious leaders, such as the imam from the UAE and the rabbi from Jerusalem, are currently engaged. Those countries are engaged in active, like, high-tech genocides as we speak. So human rights, what? It just seemed really, really weird, and I think against the so-called progressive values that she was trying to sort of champion in this book. I don't know. So overall, I think this book was informative in some aspects, but it did leave a bad taste in my mouth. There's things that she should have focused on or incorporated, things I felt that could have been cut, and just the ending and some of her weird, like, naivete about big tech guys is just really, really weird. I rated it 3 stars because of those aspects. I don't think it's bad, but certain things did rub me the wrong way. And I do plan on reading more books about AI when I get the chance. Hopefully they are better. The next book I read was a physical copy I have, and that is The Bookshop by Evan Friss. Friss, A History of the American Bookstore. This was gifted to me last Christmas, and so I finally got around to reading it. It is not normally something I would pick up, but, I did find it pretty interesting. As it states, it is A History of the American Bookstore from Benjamin Franklin to Jeff Bezos. And certain chapters I found more compelling than others. Basically, I think one of the overarching takeaways I got from this book, which, I think most of us are probably aware of, is how bookstores are not just places where books are sold, but they've also served as third spaces, as communities, especially for marginalized people. And so some of these chapters he will follow and highlight the history of certain prestigious, you could say, bookstores that exist in America. There's one section that focuses on the Strand. There's another section that focuses on Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, which was in Greenwich Village, which opened in the late 1960s, and that had a lot of support and outreach for LGBTQ people. There is an African American bookstore that he highlights that was political, most of these left-wing leaning bookstores are, of course, political, right? Because books are inherently political. It was called Drum and Spear in D.C. And, of course, it was surveilled by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. What a surprise. There is also a chapter called The Aryan Bookstore where he goes into talking about Nazi bookstores that existed here in the States. And not a surprise that except for a brief period during World War II, the FBI basically left these bookstores alone. But, the black bookstores, the communist bookstores, oh no, those had to be infiltrated and watched. This is America after all. So we also get into the retail aspect of the past 20, 30 years and how bookstores have been slowly disappearing and declining. And we follow how in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of these indie bookstores were really against Borders, RIP, and Barnes & Noble, and they saw them as enemies. And now, because of Amazon, there was an indie bookseller, she literally said this, she sees Barnes & Noble as a comrade in arms against Amazon, because the bookstores, physical bookstores, are still, unfortunately, slowly disappearing. And there was an interesting chapter about Amazon and how for a couple years, I think around 2021, they did attempt to have sort of a brick and mortar type of store, but it wasn't really a bookstore. And the people that they hired not on the basis of their knowledge of books or what readers might like, but do you know how to work Amazon gadgets? And thankfully, those places actually closed. So this book was published last year, I believe. And I think maybe there could have been a chapter on social media and its impact on book selling. I mean, he does briefly mention Goodreads and that it's owned by Amazon. Because platforms like Book Talk have absolutely influenced physical bookstores. At least they've influenced, I've seen sections in Barnes & Noble. And there is so much discourse now online about how these bookish platforms are adding to overconsumption, or how we're now treating books as fast fashion. And how has that impacted bookstores? Has it impacted indie bookstores? So, that would have been an interesting thing to go into a little bit. But overall, I don't really have any criticisms of this. Again, it's not something I would normally pick up, but I'm so glad I read it. And there was something about it that was sort of comforting in a weird way and cozy. So yeah, I would recommend it if you want to know more about bookstores. And I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Immaculate Conception by Ling Huang. This is her sophomore novel, and I did do a reading vlog about this, so you can sort of get more of my thoughts in that vlog as I am reading it. But this is kind of an alternate history or alternate present that then is set in the future. It is sort of sci-fi, I would say. I wouldn't really say there's much of a horror aspect to this. So in the alternate present, we have 2 friends in art school, Enka and Mathilde, and they have this seemingly innocuous friendship that is actually laced with a lot of jealousy on Enka, the main character's part, because Mathilde is immensely talented. She has a sort of talent at school that is just heads above other people, and she constantly knows how to innovate and dodge increasing technology and how it has negatively impacted art students. We get a little bit into generative AI in this and how that negatively affects the art students at the school. And so the way society is structured in this is, it deals a lot with like surveillance capitalism, right? Which I feel is, I've talked a lot about ad nauseum in this video, but you have this big tech company that sort of segregated people and put up these barriers, and for safety reasons as well as like physical safety and also quarantine reasons. And so Enka is from this sort of underling class that has emerged as a result of these barriers of have-nots. And so there's another thing that she is very envious of Matilda of, and so she still has this eye to essentially climb out of her circumstances, right? She's at art school on a scholarship. While she's at the scholarship, she reaches out to the people that funded her scholarship, and she falls into the graces of the Dahl Corporation, and she ends up marrying the tech mogul's son, Logan. And so Logan introduces her to this new technology that the corporation is working on called Scaffold, which is a brain implantation that you can have that allows you, it's also put in the other person's brain, to access their thoughts and memory. And in a way, it is a way to essentially help ease that person's trauma. You can access their trauma, you can see what they're going through, and you can comfort them and help them work through it directly. Now, this encounter, this whole thing with the technology and how Enka and Matilda are directly impacted by this does not occur until more than halfway through the novel. So just a heads up about that. I would say my only issue with Immaculate Conception was the pacing, which I have talked about. It is both slow and fast. Like, it's the wait to get to this aspect of the novel is a while, but yet at the same time you're rushing through Enka's whole like whirlwind and like the upper echelon, and she's the courtship and marriage and motherhood and all of that, and I was like, whoa, there's a lot of telling going on. I think overall though I did enjoy this. It was very easy to read. I devoured this. I think it is better than her previous work, Natural Beauty. The writing was stronger, it was tighter, it was not so much like purple prose, which Natural Beauty also suffered from way too many heavy themes that were bogging it down in such a short novel. And I think that the themes were more interconnected. It was more, it worked better. It just, it wasn't like too much going all over the place, right? There's a lot that is being said here about technology and capitalism and its effect on art and people's trauma and how that impacts your ability to create art, and bioethics and transhumanism, which again was were themes in Natural Beauty. It's also a story a lot about codependency and care, and where do lines blur with codependency, with care into codependency, and all of that, so it was really well done, and I would recommend it. I voted it for like the first round of like horror in the Goodreads Choice Awards. It didn't make it, but definitely a book I would say you should check out, and I rated it 4.25 stars. And the last book I'm going to be discussing in this video is called Strega by Johanne Lykke Holm, translated by Saskia Vogel. This was originally published in Sweden. So this is a very short novel. It's like just under 200 pages, and it follows a 19-year-old named Reva as she journeys to work in this decrepit hotel in this remote vacation town called Strega. And she goes to work as a maid with about 8 other young women. And at this hotel, there are no guests, seemingly, until around Halloween. And during Halloween, there is an elaborate ball that is put on. Involves one of the hotel workers. She does a performance, and then after this performance, she mysteriously goes missing. That is basically the bulk of the novel. So I initially wasn't quite sure if I liked the writing style. It is very flowery. It is very poetic. At times it felt a bit too much. It is very ornate, and I think that this is an example of a novel that is a bit more vibes than plot, There is very little interiority of Rafa, the main character, or the other girls, the other coworkers. I think it's saying a lot about essentially the transition from womanhood, from girlhood into womanhood, beauty rituals, woman as performance, female archetypes. There's also nuns that live near the hotel, and I think that they sort of serve as a symbolism of escape from patriarchal expectations, but probably also exists as like part of the Madonna whore complex, etc., etc. I feel like if you read The Virgin Suicides but wished that the novel was from the point of view of the sisters instead of the neighborhood boys, you would like this. It kind of gave me the same kind of vibes. I could totally see this being directed by Sofia Coppola. So the writing, like I said, it does feel like almost some of the chapters end like prose poems. There is almost like this esoteric quality to it. So I do prefer my characters, my stories to have a little more like emotional interiority to the characters. But I was struck by several lines in this book. I did read them aloud. It was also part of my reading vlog. And yeah, I mean, I ended up rating it 4 stars, 3.75, rounded up. I thought it was fine. I don't know why it's so lowly rated on Goodreads. I would recommend it, even if I didn't really care for the writing style. And yeah, that's it. Those are the 6 books I read for about the first half or so in November. I will come back and do a wrap-up of part 2 of the other 5 books I read. But yeah, if you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe, comment, let me know if you have read any of these books or if you plan on reading them. And yeah, I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.